Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced for RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm Gary Barker.
And I'm Leon Gettler.
And this is episode 4 in our series for 2017. And today's date is Friday the 24th of February. And Leon, we're talking to...
That's right, Morellan Singh and Muguntan Siva. They're Indian fund managers. They're talking to us about investment opportunities for India and Australia.
Yeah, India is a market that I think Australia can do very well in.
There's a lot of Indian money that can be invested in Australia too.
They've got some very large companies. Tata, for example, one of the biggest car makers in the world. And then after that, Nicholas Gruen.
That's right. Nicholas Gruen's going to be talking to us all about RBA decision-making.
And look forward to that. There's always something original from Nick. So let's listen to Indian investment chat.
Tell us about the investment opportunities in India.
Leon, India is a very fast-growing market. It has one of the strongest GDP growths of a developed or leading nation in the world at over 7.5%. It also has a thriving ecosystem of entrepreneurs, which means there's a continual flow of new companies, companies that are emerging to become global leaders that are part of the investment markets. So for Australian investors who are today starved of growth options, potentially, then India makes an interesting investment because it provides exposure to several companies that are growing earnings strongly through top-line revenue growth, which is something that we don't see frequently in our marketplace today.
And does the reverse apply to investing in Australia?
I think Indians typically have invested more broadly in their market, but Indian businesses are now looking to expand the markets that they operate in because a lot of them have become successful, have built a strong brand name, and are now looking to undertake partnerships with businesses around the world.
India has certain issues economically in terms of its growth. What's your view about that?
India needed reforms. It needed the government to act in a more better way. So what we are seeing currently is that the influence of the government or the role of the government in the economy is shrinking. Many sectors have been made part of an automatic approval route. And a lot of taxation incentives, policy incentives have been created for foreign institutional investors, foreign direct investors to come into the country and invest. By conservative estimates, India needs 1.5 trillion US of infrastructure investment, and the domestic institutions plus the government are insufficient to provide that. So obviously foreigners are being invited to do that, and it's a win-win situation for both outside investors as well as the economy.
I imagine infrastructure would be a key investment areas. There's obviously a need in areas such as roads.
So our focus as a business is to introduce India as an investment destination for Australian investors. So really say, okay, you need exposure to growth assets in your portfolio, and India provides an interesting option. Yeah, so as Mrinal pointed out, infrastructure need in India is significant. Understand that they really need foreign investment to come into the country because local investment isn't sufficient to achieve that demand. However, Australia has tended to be a bit of a laggard when it comes to India. Our focus and interest has been more aligned with China, given our commodity influence and commodity producing and their requirements for it. So countries like Canada, Norway, the Middle East have been big investors in India predominantly because they are commodity producing countries, and India is a country that thrives when commodity prices fall. So they've taken advantage of the fact that India needs infrastructure and started to build, in some cases, even offices based in India to try and grow their level of investment in the country. Australia, despite being a commodity producer, has been a bit of a laggard, and I think it's more education, understanding and reduction of the fear factor, which by perception or reality exists, that needs to happen before that can occur.
The Australian government appears interested in forging a trade agreement with India. Do you think that'd be useful, and how might it work?
I think it's a first step of part of a path that needs to be built. Australian corporates have typically not known how to interact with Indian corporates. If you think about it, an Australian corporate tends to focus on things like productivity, cost cutting, logistics, to drive its potential profit going forward. In India, it's more about scale, volume. You've got 1.3 billion people, a huge consumption market with 50% of the population being below 25. That's emerging over time. Australian businesses need to be able to understand perhaps the price point of doing business in Australia is very different to what you might have as a price point in India. The free trade agreement will at least start the process of engagement and then allow the transfer of IP between the two countries. And Australia, as you know, needs to start focusing more on IP given commodity influence is reducing from where we were.
Are there things Australian companies should look out for?
Yeah, so the middle class is, one of the strongest growing parts of the economy. The GDP per capita is still quite low at 1,700 US per person. And what we're seeing, however, is as these youths turn 18, for example, there are 1 million Indians turning 18 every month. As these people come on board and become employable, their tastes also become more aspirational in nature. They go from needs to wants and desires. And that's where Australian corporates that have a product which is a leading product can, benefit from a technological front or, being masters of a domain in terms of an IP that they can export to India if they can, build something which is competitive. Because India is a very competitive landscape, but it has the benefit of volume.
To add to that, India is a consumer of commodities too. And Australia is amongst the foremost exporter of commodities. India recently signed the Paris Convention. So the future investments for energy production in India are going to be more cleaner because we've committed to more carbon reduction. Clearly, India is eyeing Australia's uranium production to expand its nuclear power generation capacity. So commodities export from Australia particularly is of interest to even India.
Are there things Australian companies should look out for?
Yes, so I think the past experiences of Australian investors have been clouded by issues such as joint venture projects not going according to plan, the currency being an impediment to investment returns, perhaps the cost of doing business being over and above what was anticipated because of the red tape that exists. So I think the biggest thing an Australian corporate or an Australian investor needs to think about is what is the optimal way to do this business? How much local partnering do I need to know? How much knowledge do I actually need to build up before I take this step? Sometimes in the past it's been hasty and it's not been done with enough thought behind it. You're just saying I'm going to joint venture with an Indian company may not necessarily be the optimal result without going through the education process.
Nonetheless, some Indian businesses are very successful internationally, Tata for instance, so an investment deal ought to be quite promising.
Yes, so I think one of the biggest issues on a cultural front and being able to understand the thought process of how an Indian entrepreneur might run his business versus an Australian corporate. And I think most of that comes from volume and the way you think when you've got a volume-driven business versus how we do business over here. But there's also several cultural influences on how business is done and practiced. India has a English common law, and it's got a very strong and stringent judicial system, but you can get mired in, red tape, and that's what you can avoid by taking the right steps. So we feel sometimes, those right steps haven't been taken, and therefore the perception is India is a hard place to do business.
Yes, you're right. The Indian entrepreneurship spirit is quite high, and this is a very important point that you mentioned. Almost 75% of the economy is privately held. In fact, the markets also represent that more than 75% of the market is in the private domain of things. So the government is a very small part of the economy. Its role is in fact shrinking with passage of time, and that's a good sign. And the entrepreneurs, the names you took like Tata, there are enough the IT companies in India. There are pharma companies which are global now. So there are businesses in India which have kind of become multinational. The most global IT firms out of Silicon Valley have a lot of business that happens out of India now. So there are things they've done, and they have obviously made a mark in a lot of sectors and industries.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.